Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. A North Korean ballistic missile fired by Russia in Ukraine contained hundreds of components linked to American and European companies. Today we discuss ways to disrupt North Korea's illicit procurement network. We also discuss whether the Korean peninsula is on the brink of a nuclear war.
미국 놈들이 주도하에 군사적 긴장 격화로 물리적 충돌에 의한 확전으로 전쟁이 발발할 위험은 현저히 높아졌고
export controls, sanctions, interdiction, and law enforcement actions to prevent the DPRK from acquiring sensitive items and technology that
In the studio with me, Mr. Seiler, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Seiler was former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea on the National Intelligence Council until July of last year. Mr. Seiler was the Special Envoy for Six-Party Talks and National Security Council Korea Director during the Obama administration. Mr. Seiler also served as Senior Analyst for U.S. Forces Korea. Mr. Seiler has worked on North Korea issues for over 40 years. Also joining us, Mr. Ankit Panda, Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Panda authored Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so very much.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Mr. Panda, Kim Jong-un openly talks about a war with South Korea, but there are analytical data that North Korea is an impoverished country with human rights problems. When it comes to the conventional weapons, the Global Firepower 2024 ranks military strength of countries, put South Korea at the 5th and North Korea at the 36th, down by 2 notches from last year. We can't ignore the fact that North Korea, of course, has nuclear weapons. But many experts think that the possibility of a full-fledged war on the Korean peninsula is quite low, whereas localized military confrontation is much more likely. Under such circumstances, what deterrence measures would you propose so that Kim Jong-un doesn't even dream about localized military confrontations?
Sure. Thanks, Eun. I mean, the first thing to say about deterrence of any adversary, not just North Korea, is that one needs to communicate credibly that the costs of resorting to some kind of undesirable action inimical to our interests will simply be disproportionately outweighed. The benefits will be outweighed by the costs. And so the alliance is in a position where I do think today we credibly communicate that to North Korea. And as you also said, it's been well known for a number of years that the Korean People's Army, everything from its nutritional basis, the food that the soldiers eat, to the fuel that their vehicles and mechanized divisions would rely on, would simply not allow for protracted, high-intensity warfare. Of course, I do think this is one of the reasons that North Korea does see tremendous tactical and strategic value in offsetting many of these limitations of its conventional forces with nuclear weapons, which they do intend to use rather early in a crisis or conflict. And then to the broader point about preparations for a war, this is what armed forces do, and I don't see any serious sign that Kim Jong-un is about to make a decision imminently to resort to that kind of a deliberate escalation with South Korea and the United States.
But given the statements coming out of both North Korea and South Korea, are you concerned at all that there could be some escalations on the Korean peninsula?
So I do think the potential for a crisis resulting in a loss of life is greater now than it perhaps was 12 months ago or 24 months ago. I think Kim Jong-un feels quite confident for reasons having to do with his geopolitical position today in Northeast Asia, for reasons having to do with his capabilities, his economy is improving. But by the same token, all of these things that give Kim greater confidence, I do also think give Kim potentially more to lose by initiating such a crisis or a conflict. But in the case where we did see a clash in the West Sea, or we saw some kind of artillery fire against South Korean territory, My hope would be that the alliance would react in a calibrated way, the sort of Goldilocks zone between doing enough to exact costs on North Korea to reinforce and convey that the alliance does remain resolute, does remain capable of deterring provocations at all levels from North Korea, without necessarily going too far and raising concerns in North Korea that the scope of the crisis might be spiraling into a place where either Kim's personal hold on power or the regime's other priorities, including their nuclear forces, might come under threat. So it's a careful balance. It's very difficult to know when exactly that balance might be transgressed in the course of a crisis, but that's exactly why we have consultations in the alliance, why we do planning, and my hope is that our planners will understand those limitations.
So you're concerned that the current South Korean government may go too far?
That's always been a concern with any crisis. It's one that I do think I have some particular concerns about under the current government, just given some of the public statements that have been made by the current defense minister, by the president himself, going all the way back to the few weeks after inauguration. Now, I understand that there is a view that these kinds of statements can augment deterrence against a country like North Korea that does react to strength on some level. I do think there's evidence of that. But strategic messaging, particularly from senior political leaders, is also part of how one's adversary understands the political objectives that we might seek to prosecute in the course of a war or a crisis. And so for those reasons, I would prefer that the alliance's strategic messaging towards North Korea be slightly more calibrated.
Mr. Seiler, is careful balancing, is that the most effective way to deal with North Korea's provocations?
You know, Eun-jung, that's been a debate ever since, frankly, the armistice itself, and we've lived for the past 7 decades with a North Korea that unfortunately finds value in such provocations. They see coercion as a much more useful diplomatic tool than actual dialogue. They have confidence in their ability to shock and surprise the South and maintain escalation control, because as they engage in all of these actions, what they don't want to have happen is that a all-out war would break out, and one which, as Ankit noted, in terms of the conventional capabilities of the North, their force is not ready to handle. But you know, as we look at a history of these types of behaviors and these types of actions, you know, we ask ourselves all the time, you know, what is the best approach to addressing the reassurance demand signal from our ROK allies of South Korean people that the United States and the ROK have the wherewithal and the means necessary to defend itself, to send a message as deterrence to North Korea that this behavior will not yield the benefits that they think it will. And at the same time, an assurance signal to Pyongyang that should it behave well, that an alternative path is available. And we've done that quite successfully. You know, 2023 was a stellar year in terms of restoring a lot of our extended deterrence capabilities and confidence, particularly among the South Korean people, in those capabilities. And it's not surprising that North Korea's response to 2023 would be to drive up tension on the peninsula, blame those very actions that are responding to North Korea's growing nuclear missile threat, blaming those actions for increasingly harsh and threatening rhetoric, and seeking to drive a debate in Washington and in Seoul about the efficacy of a hardline approach, of the efficacy of these types of actions, and of course the risk involved. And so that there are a number of analysts who are concerned about primarily not so much what North Korea will do, but overreaction on South Korea's part, is exactly Pyongyang's intention, is to drive this wedge, to undermine confidence in the policy of the President of the Republic of Korea, and in the U.S. approach. And so going forward, we have to calibrate this quite well, as Ankit noted, because it's going to be an important mix of this reassurance, assurance, and deterrence, you know, both at the nuclear level and at the conventional level.
And Mr. Seiler, spreading fear in Seoul and Washington that a nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula is quite possible is often seen as part of psychological warfare by North Korea. Do you think Seoul and Washington are responding to it with proper psychological and information operations based on your experience in the intelligence community? Do you think Seoul and Washington need to do more?
I think the messaging right now is authoritative and credible, in that we've seen concerns expressed that North Korea may have chosen the path to war. There's been a lot of criticism, a lot of debate about that, and it's given airtime to a lot of diverse voices, many of whom have explained, why North Korea is seeking to create this environment. The reality, as our national intelligence estimate from last year laid out, that we do need to think about the expanded options available to Kim Jong-un as his nuclear arsenal increases in scale and scope and diversity. But for right now, the fact that we're not really witnessing any of the types of actions you would see leading up to war, that we see the psychological warfare that is intended to make us double guess our decisions on extended deterrence and exercises and military posture. So I think right now, North Korea's got a unique messaging strategy. They've got an audience that is receptive to their arguments, an audience that is skeptical and opposed. These voices are out there arguing it. So I don't know that there's anything more that we need to do actively to refute this story, other than to continue to demonstrate strong confidence in the U.S. ROK alliance, fight tonight readiness on the part of our forces and our ROK forces there. And again, that open door to diplomacy that puts challenges. If indeed all North Korea wants is an opportunity to talk to the United States, it's very easy for them.
Do you think even in Seoul and Washington, there are those who are receptive to North Korean messaging?
I think there are people that are influenced by it. I mean, if you ask a number of people who believe, Kim Jong-un, the regime was mostly motivated to pursue nuclear weapons because of what happened with Libya, what happened in Iraq, that it is U.S. hostile policy. It's our exercises that drive tensions every spring and every fall, when indeed North Korea's 1 million man Korean People's Army is out there doing military exercises themselves. So unfortunately, there is a information cycle in which a KCNA statement or some other type of threat gets into Western media. It generates headlines. It influences perceptions, and unfortunately, does kind of give North Korea a lot more voice in the public discourse and debate about the issue than it probably deserves.
Mr. Panda, according to former U.S. Forces Korea officer and an elite North Korean defector who is well versed in the thinking of the North Korean leadership, said that Kim Jong-un continues provocations because he knows for sure that South Korea and United States will not act decisively. And they say that both Seoul and Washington should put into action to prevent escalation, such as shooting down a North Korean missile on the launch pad or mid-air. Do you agree?
Well, so I don't think I fundamentally agree with that assessment or recommendation. But what I will also say is that I think it is, of course, essential to understand what the North Korean leader is thinking about the state of risks on the Korean Peninsula, the advantage of resorting to war, or the advantage of resorting to a limited crisis. But of course, as analysts, we need to be quite humble about our ability to actually penetrate his mind. And I think we've seen this with other leaders around the world as well. Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, Xi Jinping certainly in China as well poses similar challenges. But to get back to the questions around deterrence, I think this is an absolutely essential component. How will psychologically the leader of a country like North Korea interpret some of those actions that you just referenced? The idea of destroying a missile on a launch pad. Will that leader see that as a show of resolve and commitment by the alliance, or might he conversely begin to see that as the start of a broader process of disarming him of his nuclear weapons in a crisis, which is something that South Korea and the United States, of course, do talk about publicly. And if it is the latter, I can see that being rather dangerous for the prospects of escalation control. One of the lessons the United States and the Soviet Union learned pretty early into the Cold War is that threatening the other side's nuclear command and control or forces can be precisely the spark that could lead to uncontrollable escalation. So while it's important to think about this, it's also important not to allow ourselves to be paralyzed in having some capacity to respond to North Korea. So the choice facing us is not between destroy all of Kim Jong-un's missiles on the launch pad in a crisis or do nothing. There are, again, a set of calibrated and graduated options in between those.
Yeah, I think it's important to discern, three broad types of actions that we might observe. One would be a flare-up of tensions along the DMZ, off in the disputed waters. And if you look at the history on the peninsula, there's not been many occurrences when actually unintended flare-ups lead to some type of crisis. The second type of provocation you have is a premeditated, limited objective provocation on North Korea's part. It's designed to inflict some political cost, to drive a debate about North Korea policy. I'm thinking like the Cheonhan sinking and Yeonpyeong-do shelling are great examples. And the third type of provocation that we're worried about is one that we haven't yet seen, thank heavens, which would be a provocation that is an initiation of a premeditated path to war, whether all-out war to reunify the peninsula or a significant scale conflict that seeks larger revisionist goals that we've seen in the past. In this case, there really is no de-escalation because North Korea has already made a premeditated decision to walk down that path. And so your choice about whether to respond to those initial observed signs is to come out strongly to deny North Korea, to threaten punishment, or to try to reassure and bring back to the table. In that case, you're talking about what best is suited to halt expansion of that conflict. Our instincts are to try to return to an armistice state. That's a good instinct when such periods of tension are de-escalatable. In many cases, they won't be. And I think this is where the tension between how our ROK colleagues who've looked at this for decades and who have had to live with this threat versus U.S. experts who have a markedly different perspective to begin with.
Yeah, I broadly agree with that.
Yeah.
I want to move on to another topic which raises global concern, which is North Korea-Russia arms trade. There's a lot of attention on North Korean missile fired by Russia into Ukraine, and findings show that one of those North Korean-made missiles had hundreds of components coming from American and European companies. Now, Mr. Seiler, isn't this much more serious than Russia just simply using North Korean weapons, but finding these Western components in North Korean missiles?
Well, there's a lot of serious problems with what we're seeing over there in Ukraine. The prolonging of the suffering, the death and destruction being put on the Ukrainian people by Russia, now armed with North Korean missiles. The fact that North Korea itself is so openly supporting Russia's efforts and aligning with Russia and siding with a markedly dangerous Vladimir Putin. The fact that China has not been more clear in condemning these actions and taking efforts to try to discourage this cooperation, and the challenges that we face with getting the international community galvanized around efforts to try to prevent the transfer of these types of components and materials. This is a very complicated issue. I think Ankit's in a much better position to talk in more detail about it, but we have been trying to prevent these types of transfers. This is not something that is particularly new or surprising, but I'd like to hear your perspective on, were you shocked by the amount of these technologies and what can we do about it?
Also, Eunjung, we've known for a while that the North Koreans, of course, while they talk about self-reliance, they ultimately do depend on a globalized illicit supply chain to enable a lot of their development of especially new and advanced missile technologies in particular. And of course, they are in the process of somewhat indigenizing this, but there are, of course, some components that the North Korean economy simply doesn't have a comparative advantage in. So semiconductor components, which are central to modern missile systems and their guidance systems, which might need to communicate with satellites. Obviously, the North Koreans aren't building that themselves. And as Sid alluded to, this is fundamentally a question about export controls. And so we do have an export control regime in the West designed to deprive countries of like North Korea of access to such capabilities. But as you've probably seen in those images released of the debris from the North Korean missiles, many of these components are physically rather small. They can be procured by ordinary individuals on online marketplaces in China, in Southeast Asia, in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa. And so the ability of individuals with either direct connections to the North Korean state or indirect connections to intermediaries that might do business with North Korea is precisely how these systems have entered the country over a number of years. And so tamping down on this fundamentally is going to be quite difficult. And of course, I like to kind of describe the phenomenon of North Korean adaptation to export controls as one of sort of ecological adaptation. So as the international sanctions regime and export control regime has been set up over now almost 2 decades to deal with this, the North Koreans themselves, just like an organism in nature might adapt to selection pressures, so too do they find ways to keep these supply chains effectively operational for them. And now, I will also say on the Russia front, North Korea and Russia share a land border, they share contiguous territorial waters. And so we should also think about the two-way trade that's going on here. So there's no such thing in this globalized world as a truly indigenous missile system. But I think the goal of our export control policy should continue to still be how hard can we make it for the North Koreans?
So you just mentioned about North Korea's heavy reliance on foreign components. And there's a group of people who think North Korea just imported its entire missile system from Russia or China. And another group of people who think North Korea learns from foreign technology, from reverse engineering, and are rapidly gaining expertise. What do you think is more likely?
So I'm squarely in the latter group. I think there's sufficient evidence going all the way back to North Korea's procurement of its first Scuds from Egypt in the late 1970s that reverse engineering, the old analogy of instead of giving a man a fish, it's much better to teach him to fish. And I think the North Koreans try to embody this. Kim Jong-un in particular has invested quite heavily in what you might call human resources. So ensuring that younger North Koreans in their 20s and 30s, are studying aerospace engineering, mechanical engineering, that the country will have a steady base of talent over the coming decades to continue reverse engineering, continue sustaining these capabilities. So while they do rely on components from overseas, they have a strong strategic interest in making sure that by teaching themselves to fish, in effect, that they can keep these supply chains running for themselves. And of course, if they were indeed relying on wholesale missiles being shipped from Russia or China, I don't think we'd be seeing the proliferation pattern that we're seeing today of North Korean missiles going into Russia. So I think what this tells us is that they actually have a fairly sophisticated mass production capability internally for many of these new short-range missiles. While they will rely on external inputs to sustain that rate of production, I do think that they feel confident with their existing illicit procurement networks that they will be able to keep that going.
Mr. Seiler, the North Korea-Russia relationship seems to be moving towards a strategic partnership. Where do you think the relationship is heading to, the direction and the level? Mr. Panda just mentioned about teaching them how to fish. Will Russia help them teach how to fish with sensitive military technologies?
Well, one cannot help but be gravely concerned about the recent developments. I think because it shows not just an opportunistic, business deal between a supplier and a customer seeking missiles for the battlefield in Ukraine, but that the two sides have used the war and North Korea's support, both rhetorically and practically, for the conflict as a tool to align themselves in a strategically, what one might call a depraved, dangerous, and desperate way. The good news is that when you have these highly personalistic, autocratic tyrants like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, they have short attention spans, they're egotistical, they're opportunistic, and there's inherent paranoia even among fellow members of the bloc that will place limits on how much cooperation we can actually see. But if we see Russia in particular finding a low risk in enabling and encouraging North Korea on its nuclear forces, on its missile forces, on its conventional forces. So even beyond the question about very sensitive weapons technology, there's even less sensitive weapons technology that if provided to North Korea, and it can improve their targeting, their missile performance, their air force, their naval capabilities, or their ground forces capabilities, they could have a very profound impact on the balance of power on the peninsula. And that's what we need to be worried about at this time.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Panda, Mr. Seiler, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.